Good morning and welcome back to day 2 of the AAXX 100 conference, where we have an extremely busy day ahead of us, but hopefully as exciting and invigorating and inspiring as yesterday was. So thank you very much to all our speakers and also to the audience who made such an amazing contribution to the discussion yesterday. So just very quickly, good morning and welcome. We're back at the AA for the morning, and then there's a split of sites this afternoon, but we'll remind you about that later. Just one small piece of information really before we start the first session. One of the things which has been organised to kind of go alongside the conference is a coach tour of 100 years of women in architecture, organised by the 20th Century Society, and which will take us on a wonderful, magical, not mystery tour, because they're telling us where we're going, around London, Cambridge on Sunday and Monday. So just wave this at you, but there are details in the exhibition on the invigilator's desk if you want to go. There are still just a few places if that tickles your fancy. So just to let you know about that. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand over to Jane Beckett, who is the chair of our first session.
I got off a bus at Liverpool Street Station. 2 lads were fighting each other and accidentally both punched me in the face. So is that a different kind of collaboration? Down I went, so I need a stick. But my next door neighbour in Norfolk said, "You need a stick." And he made a stick for me out of the hedgerow. So there you are, collaboration. When I was thinking about this session, I thought of some time ago in the AA when I worked in here, and I minded 2 children for what became quite a famous couple in architectural terms. I said to these 2, "Is it nice in your household? Do you enjoy being in your house?" And the little girl said, no. I said, "Why not?" And the boy said, "You tell her." So the little girl said, "We have a donkey and a lion in our house and they don't get on." Those 2 children are now, well, one is an architect, and their surname was Smithson. I'll leave you to decide what kind of collaboration there could be between a donkey and a lion. Okay. I just want to say a few things before we begin about collaboration, so you start thinking about the issue. Think of the word, that's it, collaborare. In other words, co-labour. That's what the root of the word is. Is that what collaboration is about? What forms of collaboration are there? What forms of collaboration can there be? At this moment, I'm a rather painful recipient in different forms of collaboration. I have an architect working, converting a listed building for me. His idea of collaboration is that I should scrape the walls and find out what the original colours were. There has to be a millimetre by an inch, otherwise it's not correct. Why these 2 dimensions, I've no idea. But anyway, so there's me scraping away and I'm thinking, what am I doing? I'm really bothered about what this is going to look like, not what the colour on the walls is going to be. But that's his idea of collaboration with the client. So is it only collaboration between equals? What's collaboration between people who are not equal? Is there collaboration in something that is towards the people who do technical drawings, make models, the client, dare I say? The other side of me is involved in a terrible project which is being built by a combination of one of the deadliest, I would say this word and I'll probably get shot as I leave here, one of the deadliest local authorities, the City of London and Islington Borough Council, to extend a listed estate, Golden Lane Estate in East London, by adding to it the most horrendous scheme you ever set eyes on. So City of London thinks the people, the inhabitants of this estate should have no stake in this whatever. You do what you're told. Islington will talk to you, but you have to do what they say. The architects tell us, and there are a huge majority of architects who live in this estate, that we know nothing about the quality of architecture. So what I'm trying to do is use this to pull it about in different directions to question collaboration. How does collaboration work in terms of divisions of labour, divisions of gender, forms of hierarchy within a practice? What's the other word that's used in this context often here? Connectivity, the buzzword of Harvard Business School. That's the crucial thing. Connectivity across people on an instant level. Synchronicity of connectivity, they call that. Asynchronicity is when you can have connections across different time lapses. So can there be connection across globally with people working in different places? Having also been a recipient on the end of a Norman Foster project, I can tell you that's something that's quite painful. Ended up with lots of leaking roofs and buckets of water, and Sainsbury's making a lot of money out of you. But think about it carefully. What does this actually mean? What do partners mean in these contexts? Are they necessarily same gender partners or different gender partners? What is a partner? That's a kind of dodgy word at this moment, isn't it? Partner, it's a kind of baggy word that takes up quite a lot of things. I think also go back to the word collaboration. Collaboration has a downside, doesn't it? People of my generation, and probably young people now, collaboration is somebody who's working with the enemy against you. So maybe collaboration isn't quite as comfortable as you might think. Is the idea of collective part of a collaboration? Do collectives work? Now I know that some of these questions will be raised by the two speakers who are following me, otherwise I wouldn't have trailed you down this deadly path. So I would think you might need to think carefully about partners in one of the contexts and collectivism and collectivity in another, and how gender issues inflect into both these cases. Okay, then it's my privilege to introduce the two speakers, and equally to say welcome and hello. And I haven't been in this room for nearly 70 years, I don't think, so it's quite a startling experience. We didn't decide who was going first, did we? Are you going first? Oh, you're going first, are you? See, gender equality, the man's supposed to... Sorry, Harry. You're certainly outnumbered in here, aren't you? Yes.
About time.
Yes, absolutely. Can I first then introduce Harry Charrington, who's Professor of Architecture at the University of Westminster. He's also a founder of an architectural magazine, was a student at Cambridge. He's both an architect, a theorist and a writer, and has written on many different issues within architecture. And he's going to talk about the issue of partners, I think, this morning. So, Harry.
Good morning, everybody. Picture the scene. Easter 2016, a room full of architectural academics from all around the UK, heads of schools of architecture at Queen's University. Somebody says, "Isn't it great that Zaha's won the gold medal? The first woman to win." But she wasn't, someone else pipes up. Actually, it was me. Ray Eames was. In fact, Zaha was the fourth. First Ray, then Patty Hopkins, then Sheila Twomey. But, says another member of the audience, they were only partners. What is it about partnerships that so upset us, that we find so difficult, that makes us so anxious as architects and architectural historians? Because in my experience in Queen's shows, it's not just the public and the media who insist that Zaha Hadid was the first female recipient of the RIBA gold medal. It's many architects as well, and they are equally willing to dismiss their own peers as only partners. A dismissal that makes them complicit in denigrating large numbers of their own profession, including, and above all, women. In any history or theory, we need to be able to study singular subjects and objects in detail, and we need to be able to make generalizations about those subjects and objects that transcend context, because without generalizations, we can't really describe or change culture. To quote Adorno, theory is not bowing down to every immediate thing. But nevertheless, there's a need to be alert to decontextualizing the subject and object in a way that undervalues the importance of those constituting contingencies that are formative agents in shaping the story. What I want to do in this short talk is to consider the link between, or intersectionality of, women practitioners and architectural partnership. And I want to make 2 points. Firstly, that women practitioners and architectural partnerships are overlooked. But in being overlooked, partnerships have enabled a space for women to practice within a male-dominated profession and building industry. And secondly, that as much as this hidden form of practice has enabled women and others to practice architecture, so it has also obscured their legacy. So back to the RIBA gold medal winners for a moment. Despite being the predominant form of architectural practice in the professional era, partnership has been largely ignored in architecture's historiography and in the architectural profession's telling of its story to itself. Only a further 2 partnerships to the 3 already mentioned have been awarded the RIBA President's Gold Medal. Quite an astonishing thing. The myth of individual genius endures in architecture's historiography to such an extent that even when a partnership is considered, and you'll find a few single partners left out of the partnerships they had on that slide, even when a partnership is considered, it focuses on one partner alone, rather than the creative dialogue and reflective practice of colleagues, as this list testifies. It seems that to recognize an explicit practice would undermine the mystery and mystique of the architect. So these 5 partnerships remain exceptions that prove a rule that assumes there is always a dominant architect, always a dominant partner. We assert that. Copious numbers of papers recognize Hook or Wren, but not Hook and Wren, suggesting there could be no allowance for complementarity and differing roles. And yet more ambiguous practice of equals, like, say, ABK, Ryder and Yates, we could think of many others, defeat us completely. The same applies to male and female partnerships. One of the partners must dominate, and no prizes for guessing which gender that's going to be, and which one is going to be assumed to be the creative one. However, I presume the same thing would also apply if we were to assess a women-only partnership, such as Elena Kiliander and Maria Strengel. The tendency is so pervasive that it's created a teleological trope in architectural history, in which research is undertaken so as to recover partners from their practices. The assumption being that it is only when they are restored to their position as singular architects that they can become whole again and be taken seriously. To put it in a nutshell, and we all know this image, is Patty Hopkins being edited out because she's a woman? Or is she being edited out because she's a partner? Or, as I would contend, both. At which point, some caveats. I'm not saying that partnerships are the only or the best way for women or men to practice. Many have flourished working running their own ateliers, like Vivi Lund. Others have benefited from the progressive shelter and anonymity of the public sector. I think of Kate McIntosh and Rosemary Sternstedt at the LCC. And in no way am I saying that the disregard for partnerships is equal to the prejudice that women have endured and endure. But I do think we neglect them. And neglect them in favour of idealised forms of practice. Partnerships fall between ideals. They are practice after the fall. Partnerships are humdrum, so ubiquitous as to be invisible, and once invisible, forgotten. And this forgetting, or to phrase it more strongly, disregard for and dismissal of partnerships matters for 2 reasons. Firstly, it contributes to one of the enduring contradictions of modern architectural history, a failure to learn from what we admire, to examine not just our why and our what, but to think about who architects are, how we do things, and how we exercise our agency. And secondly, it further marginalises the recognition of many women's contributions to architectural practice, for whom partnership has frequently provided a critical position from which to contribute to the male-dominated practice and discipline. So, in recovering partnerships involving women, what next? Well, I think we start with an acknowledgement of this double-edged sword. What has enabled women to practice in their lifetime has also masked their legacy. So there's a need to make an inventory, which hopefully might in turn evolve into a taxonomy of partnerships. There's a need to locate unrecorded partnerships, such as Amancia Williams and Delphina Galvez de Williams. Or more closely to home, Chapman Taylor was formed 58 years ago by Bob Chapman, John Taylor, and another AA graduate, who I'm not sure is in the exhibition next door, Jane Durham, still alive, the only surviving partner. And the reason that she's not on the practice name, she told me, was because she thought that one day she might get married and change her name, so she thought that wouldn't be very good for the practice. But it is an extraordinary thing that probably the most recognizable address in London was designed by a woman, but I'm not sure how many people know that. There's also a need to delve into the anonymity of acronyms, a very useful thing. Whatever happened to the rest of Team 4? Sue Rogers, Wendy Cheeseman, Georgie Walton, because they also built Britain. There's a need to interrogate partnerships that have been recognized, because even the most illustrious ones have often come with assumptions and insinuations that distort their work. And the commissioning of that work, even if it didn't stop her very successful practice, Jane Drew was grotesquely patronized in her lifetime. And together with other apparently successful partnerships, found that her work attracted a particular kind of patronage. Gordon and Ursula Bowyer were apparently well accepted in the London architectural scene. But as Ursula has said, they did find they got to do an awful lot of nice interiors. This is a partnership that built one of the most important buildings of the Festival of Britain. So, part 2. We're going to move to Finland. And we're going to shift focus for a reason. Not only because it's home to perhaps one of the most famous instances of inattention to not one, but two female partners in the 20th century, Aino and Elisa Alto, but because such heedlessness took place in very different circumstances to the UK. And I suppose also Finland is also acknowledging a centenary celebration next month, its own existence, 6th of December. So, in Finland, the role of women seems assured. In 2014, 47% of practicing architects, not just students, were women. Moreover, women have a long lineage, since Signe Hornberg was the first female architecture graduate in the world who graduated from Helsinki Polytechnic in 1879. The reasons for this established success are myriad. A wider general emancipation of women, with already in 1930, 1/3 of all students being women, much better maternity provision. The establishment of Finnish architecture itself as a concept within the Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire, conferring an avant-garde status on it from the very start. And even as late as 1896, there were only 100 qualified architects in the country, meaning there was no dominant large professional body of established and male practitioners. And finally, as Finland has a highly developed competition system for even small public buildings, it gave its authors a place to remain invisible there as well. So a quick gazetteer to just give a flavour of this. Vivi Lern, really one of the great Finnish architects, full stop, running her own practice. Elsie Body built copious buildings, great urbanist as well. Eva Kuhleveld Ekelund built several buildings in Helsinki. And Kerttu Rytkönen, the Salus Hospital. I could have shown quite a number more. After independence as well, the public sector has a role, and still does, unlike here. Many women work for the nascent public bodies that emerged after 1917, perhaps most surprisingly for the Ministry of Defence. So Elsa Arokallio with the Kauhava Barracks, and this is a name that Rachel's already mentioned, Marta Martikainen-Yppiä with the Taivalahti Vehicle Battalion Barracks in Helsinki. And these women oscillated between working in their own ateliers and in partnerships. So Vivi Learn worked often with Amos Lindgren. Lindgren was both Aino and Alvar Aalto's professor. Martha Martikainen Yppia with Ragnar Yppia built the Turku Hospital, like New Scotland Yard, about to be demolished. And finally, Martha Blomstedt with Matti Lampeen, the Alanko Hotel in Hämeenlinna. Unless all this seems a bit too rosy, and you're thinking, oh, Shangri-La, which is one of the big problems of Finland's historiography, a little bit too rosy, a little bit rose-tinted looking back. Of course, these architects were dominated on the whole by their male peers, the ones you've probably heard of. And actually, curiously, there's been no major exhibition of women architects in Finland since 1982, which I think is quite bizarre, or tells us that they're so established it doesn't really need doing. Nonetheless, for all of this context of success, during the time of Aino Marcio Alto and Alvar Aalto's partnership between 1924 and 1949, they were in the company of other successful women and partnerships, and a large body of buildings by women had been built. And in 1942, Architecta, the Women's Architecture Society, was established with Aino Marcio Alto as a founding member, and last month it celebrated its 75th anniversary. And by the time Elisa Alto and Alvar Aalto became partners in 1958, they were an even more established company. The likes of Reima and Riley Pietala's work and Heikki and Kaija Siren's sublime Otaniemi Chapel. So there's a real heritage of achievement that these people are part of. And yet still, Aino and Elisa Aalto are overlooked, and their legacies are obscured, and their contribution all but erased from that institutionalized term, Aalto. Because there's no doubting how much they both contributed as part of a partnership. Aino's training as a joiner, her brilliance with textiles and landscape, and a concern for design for all and a sensitivity to social space and congregation that is the very hallmark of Aalto's work, and which her photographs of both historic locations and the Aalto's own buildings stress over and over again. And if Aino was ignored, then it's even more the case with Elisa. Despite her taking artistic responsibility for the atelier for over 2 decades during Alvar Aalto's own decline from the late 60s, and after his death, supervising the construction of buildings such as the Essen Opera House, that are now so evidently part of what we call the Alto canon. Now, I should declare an interest in this. Elisa was my boss for 2 years, and never bettered. And she was certainly formative about how I see architectural practice and the atelier. I've written about it. So let's conclude. I think we have a lot to do to recover the legacy of a huge number of women practitioners. But to do this, I think we have to acknowledge the entanglement and the agency of partnership. Let's not pull them out of context. Let's not try and disentangle things we don't really know about. Let's not make what Aino and Alvar Aalto's son-in-law, Heikki Alanen, the psychologist, referring to those trying to prise apart Aino's and Alvaro's joint life and work, called the guesses of posterity. Let's embrace the possibility of entanglement, of the messy, hazy, blurred nature of partnership, and accept it might be part of their creative genius. I'll leave the last words to Alvar Aalto, describing his relationship with Aino in a letter home from America during the war. And I quote, "Only when we're together can an unexaggerated attitude be found. Thank you."
Thank you very much, Harry. We decided collectively, it wasn't any bullying, to go straight on with both speakers and take any questions and discussions at the end. But there are many, many interesting issues that have arisen out of Harry's talk. As someone who worked on Theo van Doesburg, and I spoke to lots of the old survivors, among whom were many wives, rather than collaborative partners, they all said, oh, those men, they will take all the credit. And they have. Okay, now it's my pleasure, I nearly said, to introduce Beatrice Pritchard.
Worth introducing.
Yep. Any relation to an Isacon Pritchard?
I don't think so. We've got very little information on her, but I'm quite proud that we got in there 13 years before you even you graduated 13 years before you even let them in here. So the polytechnics are progressive.
Okay, on that note, we need to be very clear, I think, that we must be ready for the legacy of what Andrea is about to talk about, I think, which is women who presumably are still alive, still practicing, and, oh, okay. Okay, well, it's my pleasure then to introduce Andrea Merrett from the Columbia University. So we're switching countries and we're switching to some degree, date-wise, I think. Andrea is working on women in architecture in the USA in the 1970s, and in particular on the Open Design Studio. She's also speaking about somebody with the wonderful acronym of WALAP, which I shall cherish for a long, long time. So can I introduce Andrea Merrett on Open Design Studio?
Thank you very much. So in the early 1970s, motivated by the women's liberation movement, American women in architecture began to organize themselves. They founded professional associations, organized conferences and exhibitions, and even created educational programs, including a women's school of planning and architecture. One question that these women activists debated was, should they advocate for professional equality, that is, to be accepted into the profession as it was, or should they try to change how architecture was practiced? The Open Design Office was a short-lived feminist architectural practice that believed the latter. Founded in 1972, the ODO offered a critique of traditional practice as well as a model for alternative office organization. For its members, everything was up for reinvention, from relationships within the office to how to work with clients, and to even the means of communicating with contractors. Women, who were a tiny minority of architects in the United States before the 70s, often felt isolated. They faced harassment and discrimination. In an article that drew national attention to the problems women faced, Ellen Perry Berkeley documented some of the issues, and these included unequal pay, needing to work harder than their male colleagues to prove themselves, discriminatory admissions at schools of architecture, firms that refused to hire women, and limited opportunities for promotion for the firms that did. Despite these challenges, it was also a period of optimism due to the increasing number of women entering the profession. By 1972, the enrollment of women in architecture schools was beginning to rise, and the new feminist movement was spurring women to join together to fight discrimination. The Open Design Office was part of a larger movement of women's initiatives, both in architecture and more broadly. Feminists were creating businesses and organizations to benefit themselves and other women, including credit unions, bookstores, education programs, health centers, galleries, publishers, and women's centers. The Boston-Cambridge area was a major center of feminist activism in the 60s and 70s, and home to groups such as the radical feminists Bread and Roses and the Boston Women's Health Collective, who authored Our Bodies, Ourselves. And in 1971, the members of Bread and Roses and several other groups took over 888 Memorial Drive, an abandoned building previously used by Harvard's Graduate School of Design for its technology workshops. The women who occupied it created the Liberated Women's Center, which eventually moved to another permanent location. So it's in this context that women in architecture and the design professions started to organize themselves in Boston particularly. The Open Design Office evolved from discussions at meetings of WALLOP, Women Architects, Landscape Architects, Planners, the first of several women's organizations created in the 70s across the United States. In late 1971, about 20 women architects, planners, and students in the Boston-Cambridge area began to meet to address issues in the profession. On March 4th, 1972, they held an open meeting, and over 100 women attended. For at least 2 years, WALLOP met regularly. In contrast to some of the other groups, it remained a more informal, project-focused organization. So one of the first projects that WALLOP undertook was an article on flexible work schedules published in the same issue of the Architectural Forum as Ellen Perry Barclay's article. In it, the authors argued that for women to succeed in architecture, offices needed to change the culture that equated long work hours to commitment. Women were still the primary caregivers to children, and the authors thought that flexibility was needed to keep them in the profession. They also believed that flexible schedules would help both female and male employees searching to find a better balance between their work and their lives. Obviously, something we're still working on today. Further, they argued that the projects themselves would benefit from architects having more time for outside pursuits, and thus a broader perspective. In April of 1972, several WALLOP participants, Megan Lawrence, Bichi Petit, Jenny Gerard, Dolores Hayden, the urban scholar, Emily Buck-Turano, and Joan Forrester Sprague, met to discuss the possibility of opening their own office. They were interested in answering the questions: how would an office of women professionals differ from traditional men's office? What would it be like to work in architecture and planning as a member of the majority rather than the minority? What would the priorities of such an office be? They immediately agreed that it would be a nonprofit enterprise and that they would, quote, seek commissions for work with some social significance. For example, daycares and housing. Amongst their goals were to establish credibility for women, to provide a model for a new kind of office, and to research and support research on women's activities in the profession. 6 women went on to launch the Open Design Office, including Turano and Sprague. They also established a nonprofit organization, the Women's Design Centre, to focus on research and public education. Although they did not officially define the procedures for the Open Design Office until the end of the first year, the members agreed on 3 principles. The first was that all profits would remain within the firm. The members of the Open Design Office believed the structure of most offices was based on a corporate model in which senior partners were motivated by profit to exploit employees. In contrast, the Open Design Office sought to treat all its members equally and fairly. All members of the office would be paid for time work, and any profits earned would be used to subsidize research or community projects. Following the points laid out in the WALLOP paper, the second principle was that working hours would be completely flexible. As long as deadlines were met and members kept each other informed of their schedules, each woman could determine her own schedule. Regular meetings would be held to discuss projects and management issues. The third principle was the elimination of an office hierarchy. Decisions about management were to be reached by consensus amongst all members of the office. Each member was expected to take full responsibility for her projects, and the office would only accept projects that everyone agreed on. In rejecting a hierarchical structure, the founders of the Open Design Office were responding to an office culture that glorified the myth of the individual creator, and this speaks very much to your talk, over the reality that most projects actually required a team of people. Many offices also excluded women from advancement. In their emphasis on equality, the founders of the Open Design Office were embracing one of the tenets of radical feminism, and radical feminists who rejected hierarchies and what they thought of as male leadership qualities. And these they defined as assertiveness, domination, and an individual leader. Women's liberation organizations tried to operate without any leaders, giving every member equal say in decision-making through a consensus process, which could take hours, by the way. It was not an easy way to work. Sprague described this method of working as affiliative and compared it to women preparing a meal together, and I quote, "No one defined who was in charge." As Joe Freeman discussed, this kind of structure worked well in consciousness-raising groups, where one of the main goals was to encourage all participants to talk about how sexism and discrimination affected their lives. However, the ideology of structurelessness often became a hindrance when a group undertook a specific task or project. The members of the Open Design Office recognized this, hence formalizing their policies and procedures after a difficult first year. Whatever the aspirations of the office, a de facto hierarchy did develop. Sprague was the most experienced member. She had graduated from Cornell in 1953 and had practiced for almost 20 years, including a decade as a partner in a firm with her then husband, Chester Sprague. She was also the only registered architect in the office and brought in most of the work. For some of the members, the office did not live up to the promise of equality. Others soon realized that they preferred the security of working as employees. After the first year, 4 members left the firm and new members joined. For the 2 women who stayed with the office the longest, Magda Brazio and Marie Kennedy, Sprague's leadership role was not a problem. Sprague had invited Brazio to join the office while still a student at the Turin Politecnico. She had come to the US to marry, and she returned to the Open Design Office after completing her degree. For her, the office offered an empowering environment despite her youth and inexperience. Kennedy had graduated from Harvard's GSD in 1969 and had worked at Urban Planning Aid for 2 years before joining the office in 1973. The office appealed to her because Urban Planning Aid had also been experimenting with a non-hierarchical structure in which all responsibilities were shared, including janitorial work, and pay was based on need, not experience. So actually the secretary made the most money because she had 2 children to raise on her own. Although the Open Design Office didn't go as far with its policies, it did promise a more supportive office environment than most practices. For the first few years, the practice thrived and even turned a profit. The busiest years were 1974 and 1975, when the office had commissions for several large projects, as well as some smaller projects and consultation jobs. The type of client and how they worked with them was very important. In fact, they turned down at least one project where the client wanted to give them free rein, which is most architects' dream, since it would not provide the architect-client interaction they sought to cultivate. They aspired to work for underserved populations, especially children, women and children, and they wanted their clients to be full participants in the design process. One of the most important projects for the office was the Roxbury neighborhood rehabilitation. In the late 1960s, Harvard purchased about 30 properties in the largely African-American area southwest of downtown Boston, which it planned to demolish to expand its hospital. With help from some Harvard students who were on strike at the time, the affected tenants organized a tenants' rights association. After contentious negotiations, Harvard agreed to renovate the properties, and they hired the Open Design Office. The budget did not allow for full historic restoration, and rapid inflation curtailed the budget even further, forcing the designers to be creative. However, they saw the opportunity not only to provide design solutions, but to redesign the process. Tenants were involved from the beginning and had say in the trade-offs necessary to meet the project constraints. Aluminum siding was chosen for its economy and availability in many colors. The tenants were then offered a choice of colors for siding, trim, accent, and roofing. At the tenants' request, most of the porches, which had been scheduled to be removed, were preserved. The most innovative aspect of the project was the construction documentation. In order to economize on time, the Open Design Office used photographs instead of working drawings to communicate with the contractor. The photographs were also easier for the tenants to read, enabling them to understand exactly the work to be done on their homes. By 1976, the economic downturn threatened the livelihood of the office. The members agreed to give up their rented space and work from home. The disadvantage of the office structure was that no profit surplus was amassed to see it through a recession. Several members left to seek employment elsewhere. And the office officially closed by 1978 when Sprague moved to Newport, Rhode Island, where she developed a small housing complex of 5 apartments, one of which became her home and office. Sprague remained committed to feminist goals, although she transferred her energy from architectural practice to development. In 1978, she helped coordinate a session of the Women's School of Planning and Architecture, a program which she co-founded with 6 other women in 1974, including Kennedy and Berkeley. The 3 coordinators of the 1978 session of WISPA, Sprague, WISPA co-founder Katrine Adam, and Susan Aitchison, went on to create the Women's Development Corporation, established in 1979. They chose to set up this practice in Providence, Rhode Island, because of the confluence of community need and existing urban fabric, mostly untouched by urban renewal. The award-winning corporation continues today to renovate, build, and manage properties for single mothers and low-income families, mentally ill and disabled residents, and the elderly. However, Sprague herself only stayed involved with the Women's Development Corporation for about 2 years before returning to Boston, where she founded the Women's Institute for Housing and Economic Development in 1980. The Women's Institute was a nonprofit organization which provided technical assistance for the development of housing and economic opportunities for women. Although the Open Design Office did not last that long, it demonstrated the passion and commitment feminist architects in the 70s had to transform the profession that they were fighting to enter.
Having worked in ABK, which was about the most democratic office I've worked in UK, apart from Hampshire County, there the partners, of course, did collaborate very closely. I was with Peter Ahrens last night at his book launch, and he went into some detail about the closeness of their collaboration. They did say that their clients really wanted a lead partner to whom they could relate. I just wonder how that ties in with this Women's Collaborative in Boston.
Well, as I said, Sprague really was the central figure, despite this aspiration towards not having a hierarchy and being collaborative. And she was quite well recognized in Boston for her work, both with her husband, but also as a furniture designer. She had designed for Benjamin Thompson. And so I think she was well enough established that that her reputation kind of provided that for the clients. The type of clients, it was also affirmative action, so I think they felt that a lot of the hires they got were because they were women at that period when affirmative action was coming in. And they also, they worked, they tended to work on community projects, and a lot of their clients were also feminist groups, although the feminists tended not to pay them, which is another issue. But she did have, she did have that reputation, and I think that's what brought the work that they did get to the firm.
Can I just turn the question back to you? So in a way, are you saying that we're still so conditioned to see through the frame of a great architect that it turns back to a named person in almost all cases?
I don't know that it's about a great person. It's about personal relationships.
Okay.
I'm feeling that there is an individual who's going to take the overall responsibility rather than it being a diffuse situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing about their, like how they aspired to work was that, you know, there would always be one partner in charge of whichever project. So there was always a point person. In some ways, the collaboration was more about providing support for themselves as women in a period when it was very hostile in a lot of offices, rather than the sort of the actual working practice of working together.
Do you have a comment on that, Harry?
But I did want to kind of throw it back to you about, you know, so you asked the question of like, why are these partners not seen, or why they don't get recognized, or how it, you know, it's hard to kind of to learn about them. I also wonder about like why the sort of myth of the individual remains so strong.
Oh, blimey.
Dear President Trump. Dear Mrs. May. Dear all school education. I mean, it's so ingrained, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm afraid, isn't it? As a Canadian,
but
you might not have it so badly.
like, you know, so like in the post-war in the U.S., like Gropius was like the aspiration of teamwork and the sort of that really comes into the discourse, but then never translates to actually how the practices work or promote themselves.
Absolutely.
I mean, the issue of the Altos is more complicated in that it was an atelier, and there is a very particular tradition of Scandinavian ateliers that you know, is a much lengthier talk than I've just done, but it's pertinent to this in that there is a form of teamwork in it, but it's not teamwork at all the way that Gropius postulated it. And actually Alto would refer to Gropius's work in the States as that's not what we do, sort of thing, because he saw the problems with it. As for why the myth, I think it's for all the reasons that you're there. I think also it makes it comprehensible though. It's graspable. You just see, you know, we all know how complicated putting a building up, ever more so. But if you can just stick a name on it, it's easy. And I think that idealization of practice, forms of practice, kind of carries on. And I think it relates also to the kind of, and I say this with caution because I know I've done work with collectives, but there's a kind of interest in collective forms of practice in the UK at the moment, which I think is a sort of architects trying to reclaim their agency to an extent.
Yes.
And actually what it's doing is saying we're happy on the margins, which is where I'm really unhappy.
I think that's a really key question.
I've got a real, you know, there's a much more complex answer to that and discussion to be had about why are we interested in forms of practice. But I think this question of the ideal and the idea that you can find the magic formula is still there.
I mean, I think agency and authorship are absolutely key issues here in both cases, aren't they? But does collectivism work against that? I won't go down that. But two more questions. There's first on the left.
Harry, first of all, thank you for the two wonderful talks. I have a question for Harry Charrington. I know you end with saying, well, we weren't there, so we really don't know what was going through their heads, right? The relationship between the Altos, for example. But my experience is based on Germany and what's happened in the 20th century in German architecture. There were many couples, some very famous, some in the shadows. But what comes out very often is this feeling of ambivalence on both the part of the man and the woman. And we also have written sources that describe that for different reasons and at different points in time. Did you find anything in your research? Or maybe the question goes also to Andrea as well. Not just this ideal that we're working towards, but also this ambivalence that we have to be part of a team in some way or work collectively.
It is conflated with this issue of the atelier and gosh, how long is it ago? 5 years ago, I did a book with an architect called Vezio Nava, who worked for, he was the site architect for the Alto church in Bologna, Riola, near Bologna. And what we did was an oral history of the practice, and it was not interviews. What we did was we set it up so that we got people who worked there, worked for Artec, a couple of the structural engineers, to talk to each other. We just set up conversations and they talked. And one of the things that came out of that was, why had no one ever done it before? Answer was, the people who worked in the atelier didn't see it as interesting. They just simply said, it was my job. We did it. We were part of this atelier. We just did it. And these were people who were executing things like the Finlandia Hall. I mean, these were major pieces, and they simply said, no, we're just part of this story. And one of the things they came back to over and over again, and actually both, I think this would bring in certainly Elisa, and probably Ino as well, in as much as, except for the practice was that much smaller, and she divided her time. She was the managing director, Ino, from 1936 to 1949 when she died. She was the managing director. She ran Artek, the furniture and exhibition centre. So, she went out to work. There was this lovely thing. She went out to work and he stayed at home. I mean, I kind of love this, because the atelier was based in behind a sliding door from the house. But they were both, and Alto in a way, were part of this atelier. And that sort of idea of collective anonymity, which is embodied by the fact that none of the drawings in the Alto office were ever signed. So you can just about work out the mark of someone's hand, which is the title of the book. But that's it. That's it. It is this sort of collective thing. And what they keep on saying during these a large number of them say over and over again during the conversations is, you could do what you like. But in fact, of course, you couldn't, because you've been employed. So the whole thing was about trust, and actually the secret of that atelier is recruitment. You only recruit people you trust. And it's embodied in a way of working, a way of understanding. So, sorry, that's a bit of a lengthy answer, but it's the one I know, and I can't speak about the other practices. But I think there is, it's more complex in Finland because of this atelier tradition, which it blends into.
So would you want to push that? Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it just seems so even somehow. I mean, one of the examples that I know. Oh. Hi, it just seems so even, maybe. And there were certainly emotions involved. And I know how Aino Alto was represented in the United States. Mrs. Alto, Mr. Alto's collaborator was also there. I mean, when they come to New York for the 1939 World's Fair, there's a picture of both of them in Architectural Forum, and they're smoking their cigarettes, right? Yes. And she doesn't have a name, but he does, and she's known as his collaborator. I mean, this certainly has, it has traces, it wounds, it affects people. And so you just can't always retreat to your nice little atelier tradition where everyone's cooking, coffee for one another. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there were traces that were left. And I know from the research I've done in Germany from other colleagues throughout the 20th century, where there is also a tradition of couples working in any event. So it's different from the atelier tradition, but certainly there is this idea of partnership, which is what the Altos were certainly about, where they do amazing projects, but it's complicated on an emotional level and also on a psychological level.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And that's what I'm pushing for. And I guess the other question would go to Andrea, if you see that as well. Because I just don't think it's so simple. I just don't think, well, this is my job, and I'm making that wonderful structure, and then I go home and get paid.
No, but that's the recall. And no, I take your point. It's not. It certainly isn't simple.
And her rancor isn't directed towards her partner. Sorry, Denise Scott Brown's written a lot about this, about what it feels like to be in a partnership and be erased, and the emotions that are attached. But the rancor she articulates isn't directed to her partner, Robert. It's directed to the reception and public inscription of their work and their authorship. So you probably, if you're going to talk about emotions, I agree, but you need to sort out, how that's being configured by the individuals.
I think I'm going to put on a historian's hat here, but I think it isn't a general question that we can address here. It relies absolutely, as Harry said, on context. So what's the historical context of the moment of those people actually collaborating and working? I'm thinking of Mrs. Schroeder and the Rietveld Schroeder house. Mrs. Schroeder was a huge influence on the design of that house. She's just kind of obliterated. amazing person to have tea with, and who shot up on her roof on age 92 up the ladder, and me going, no, don't do this, please. But she absolutely had a huge input in that, and there's very little in that she would say, and I as a historian would say, that it's because the historical moment at which that house was conceived, women did not have that agency role. They were seen in the secondary role as the supporters, as she said, I'm making the tea. And you have a red cup or a yellow cup, you can choose. I don't want to divert if you're going to say something else there, Andrea.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly was very complex for Sprague because she had worked with her husband, and she remarks in a few places in the archive about being, she doesn't refer to her, that she was the silent partner, but she does refer to that dynamic of the husband-wife team where the wife is kind of in the background. So I think she definitely felt that. And so, and then she launches this new project, leaves the partnership with her husband, but they get their first commission through the husband, actually. And he has a school in Arizona, which she had done quite a lot of work with him in Arizona, and the open design office gets the interior. But then she ends up divorcing him kind of a few years later. So clearly that dynamic was happening. So part of launching this collective practice was her own trying to break away from that invisibility, and yet she chooses this collective practice where, I'm working with an archive that's almost non-existent. Like there's very, very little on this practice, and she unfortunately has passed, and mostly other people were not as emotionally engaged in it. It was just something they did for a while, and so they don't have strong memories of it. But for sure there were tensions, and it's hinted at in places in the archive. Like that first year sounded like it was really very, like those long meetings of trying to figure out how this was going to work. And then, 4 people leave the office, within a year. So yeah, it was a big, but that's happening in, there was all kinds of, Wallop also, the meetings used to go on for forever, and these other feminist organizations, there was a lot of tensions of trying to figure out how do we work in a different way, and how do we work with each other as women, never having worked with other women before, or maybe having one other woman in the office or a couple of other classmates who are women. So
I find this very strange as an art historian, because in a sense architectural historians are going over ground that art historians went over 20 years ago. Significant others about partnerships. It's not a wonderful book, but it does start addressing those questions. Why is that? Why does architectural history, does it lag behind, or am I just perceiving this through the wrong end of a telescope?
No, I don't think it does. We've been
Good.
doing this for 50 years. Yeah, we've been doing this for 50 years, I think, roughly. Well, even longer than that. The first feminist architectural histories are being done in the 70s.
Absolutely.
And I think particularly since the late 80s, early 90s, coming out of feminist art history, certainly. When I went to the Bartlett, I said, where's the feminist, approach on this course? This was 1990. Oh, we don't do it. That wouldn't happen now. But, but certainly since then, I think there's been a huge impulse to rethink. And just to plug my session this afternoon, we can have these conversations again later.
But does that change?
Merely recovery? Is that merely acts of recovery?
No, I think we've been I think a lot of feminist architectural historians have been problematizing and trying not to do recovery, because I think that's part of the problem. Yeah. The recovery reclamation thing doesn't get us anywhere.
Has that changed how architectural history is taught here at all?
There's the rub.
Yeah,
that's what I'd like us to think about.
Not
this
at all.
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a person right at the back on the left who put their hand up third, and we've strayed away from them.
Oh, they had to leave.
They left.
Oh, there's still a question.
That's no good.
Sorry, I mean, I just think as historians, one of the reasons that it's partly been neglected is that it's really hard, because to do two people, and then to do an office, and then often to do a relationship between two people who might be at the top of that office, it's a huge amount of work. And actually, I really like both of the papers today because, you know, I think they showed the sort of richness and things. And Jane's absolutely right, you know, historical circumstance, each one. And I've worked on a ton of partnerships, particularly in the 18th century, that I think helped prepare me when I was looking at male-female, or, you know, the 18th century furniture makers, mainly male, but hugely different and changing within the partnership. So it's not just that, you know, there's no magic formula, and I think we need to think about the differences and the nuances, and that's actually what I thought was really nice today, that, and actually yesterday, that lots of that stuff was coming out. And actually, I did quite like the question of outrage, because I remember being really surprised, and I must have done a lot of interviews with women architects and designers, when Leila Vignelli was the first one who told me about arguments that her and Massimo used to have, and interestingly enough, about whose idea it was. And she just said, God, I used to want to kill him, you know, because it was my idea. And that was the first person, and I thought, oh my God, has nobody else been that honest with me about it? Have they all been trying to sort of just think about their partnerships in less volatile ways? And it was important for me, I think, and maybe it's a question I ask more often now, because I didn't think to ask it before.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I think I have to stop for coffee time. Yes, yes. So, I just want to thank both speakers profoundly for raising all these questions.